Hi, I'm Nicole Tibaldi. Before I jump into my talk, I wanted to start off by sharing that this is my second year speaking at ForwardJS. This conference meant so much to me last year. I made some incredible friends who I still keep in touch with to this day. I learned a lot, and I was really impressed by the organizers and attendees alike. While we can't all be together in Ottawa today, I'm really delighted that we can still learn and share our experiences virtually, and I'm grateful that you're here. My talk today is titled Leadership 101, How to Turn Junior into Senior, and I'd like to elaborate on what exactly I mean by that. Have you ever wanted a promotion? I'm sure nearly everyone here is nodding along, and has spent some time thinking about how to move into their next role, and that was my inspiration for this talk. As I reflected on my own career, and the folks I've worked with and that I've managed, one thing was clear. There's a pretty well-known path to understanding new technical concepts and gaining exposure to new technologies, but the path to learning and practicing leadership skills is a lot less known. More senior engineers undoubtedly have strong technical chops, but they also embody many different kinds of leadership skills. During this talk, we'll walk through what those leadership skills are, how they relate to certain specific activities that take place in software development, and how you and your team can ensure that folks have the opportunity to learn and develop these skills. First, let's talk about what it means to be a senior engineer. The titles junior and senior, and many of the other terms we use to describe engineering roles, are ambiguous and mean different things at different companies or to different people. The skill sets required for each title vary, but leadership skills are incredibly valuable at any level and will help you make that next career move when you're ready. So for now, we'll focus on what leadership skills look like and put aside how the terms junior and senior might not accurately reflect one's abilities. So if you have your eye on any of these titles or are a manager who wants to help your reports achieve their goals, let's talk about this more. There's a really good article called On Being a Senior Engineer, which was written by John Alspaugh, who's the former CTO of Etsy. He captures what we'll talk about pretty succinctly. Alspaugh says, "I expect a senior engineer to be a mature engineer. In other words, one who has characteristics and abilities that can have a positive influence on an organization that are not purely technical. In my opinion, these characteristics can generally be bucketed into one of four groups: communication, the ability to plan, empathy, and understanding and focus on product concerns." The first of these groups is communication. Leaders in our engineering organizations must be strong communicators, both written and verbal, who can influence decision-making in various contexts. There are a few main ways in which an engineer's communication skills are absolutely critical. First, engineers should be able to document their work. This can manifest in a few ways. It could be a technical architecture diagram for new hires, a post-mortem relating to an outage, a decision record, or a document explaining the team's release process. Next, the ability to share context is really important. Engineers who have built up technical or business context over time will need to be able to communicate this knowledge to other engineers in order to enable the team to understand new work and contribute to important initiatives. And lastly, the ability to spec out projects is something you'll see in more senior engineers. This often means taking the result of some design and product discovery and producing documentation that can be consumed by the rest of the team that outlines one or more possible paths for shipping a deliverable. The ability to plan is also incredibly important. Proper planning allows individual knowledge to be compiled in such a way that anyone from the team can execute some work. The process of planning helps folks on the team start to see patterns in how long certain activities will take or how projects should be approached. One critical part of planning is anticipating roadblocks. Based on an engineer's understanding of a project, what are the possible technical obstacles that the team will need to overcome? And are there multiple ways to mitigate those? This requires solid knowledge of the product and the code base, and the ability to think about those two things and how they relate at a high level. Planning also encompasses breaking down work into clearly scoped sets of small deliverables with no or minimal dependencies. Breaking down work is a skill that requires a lot of practice. I can clearly remember the first project I wrote tickets for myself, and my understanding of dependencies and how to sequence each piece was weak. But the outcome was awesome for me. I learned how to do a better job of that in the future. It's important to note that, like with anything, all the skills we'll talk about are ones that might feel difficult or clunky at first, but will become second nature with practice, and will benefit both the individual and the team as a whole. The last aspect of planning that I'll talk about is estimation, which happens both at the project and the task level. It's important for engineers to be able to estimate the level of effort of a whole project, like will it take days, weeks, or months. Knowing that level of effort can be critical in determining, for example, when the work should be done. Estimation is also important in the context of small, well-scoped issues or stories that are measured like in hours or fractions of days. If a team has a collection of accurately estimated tasks, then it's easy to do some quick math to understand roughly when they'll hit certain milestones and deliver value to users, which is what most organizations really care about. And of course, any leader needs to embody empathy. They should strive to understand the feelings and motivations of their coworkers and help others whenever they can. A key point is that as part of having empathy, engineers should give useful feedback. This means not only giving feedback, but making sure that it's clear, actionable, and kind. Of course, kindness doesn't mean not telling someone when they've missed something or if they should take a different approach, but it does mean considering the other person's perspective and making it clear that the feedback isn't personal and it's for the other person's benefit. A few roles ago, I worked at a small startup called Manifold, and the front-end lead on our team, Drew, was exceptional at this. He'd give really detailed code reviews outlining what changes needed to be made, but he'd be sure to leave emoji or some positive comments as a signal to the other person that their strengths weren't going unnoticed. Leaders should also seek input from others at every level. No single person will ever have all the answers or be able to look at a problem from every angle. When seeking input, an engineer should have a clear ask, and just as they should be able to give good feedback, they need to receive feedback and input with grace and be open to new ideas. Lastly, senior engineers should look to provide mentorship to others. This is a skill that takes practice, and one that can cover both technical and non-technical areas. A senior engineer might provide technical advice and pairing, or they might work with other engineers to show them the very leadership skills that we're talking about right now. Our fourth and last bucket is product focus. Leaders should have a deep understanding of the product they're building, no matter what type of organization they work for. Whether it's a consultancy that's building new projects all the time, or a product organization that's seeking to deliver new and exciting value to their users. Understanding the why of what you're building and who it's for leads to better, more valuable software. And I have a quick and funny note on the why piece. Recently, one of my family members walked up to me with a cardboard box that I had received in the mail. I knew what was inside based on the sender's address, and while I did need the contents of the box, I didn't need it right away, so I just left it lying around. He walked up to me, handed me the box, and said, "Can you open this and give it back to me?" Not knowing why he asked me to do this, I tore into that box like an animal, removed what was in it, and handed it back to him. Having not been given any more context, I assumed it was in the way and needed to go out for recycling. It was at that point that he was like, "Hey, I needed that to store something." Since I didn't understand why I was doing what I was doing, I took the prompt the wrong way and delivered something far from his expectations. The same can be said for software development, and that's why I consider a product focus to be such a valuable skill in a senior engineer. Engineers should seek to have empathy for the user. They should think like the user and even seek out more data-driven solutions like doing market research or user interviews where it makes sense to do so, and a reasonable amount. While these practices might technically be the responsibility of another part of an organization, getting first-hand exposure to user feedback is really valuable. Then, when they're thinking about implementation, good leaders should make trade-offs explicit. How will different technical obstacles impact what's being shipped? How will it affect the design and the user experience, and is the solution acceptable? Okay, so we talked a lot about the what. of leadership skills, and now we'll start to dive into the how. My opinion is that many of these senior engineering skills are critical parts of agile practices that most organizations follow in some way, regardless of your particular flavor of agile. So first, what are engineering practices that contribute to delivering software in an agile way, and how do they relate to groups of skills that we just talked about? How can agile help you level up in your career? So let's take a step back for a second and review what agile is at its core. Atlassian has a lot of great agile coach resources online, and they describe agile as an iterative approach to project management that helps teams deliver value to their customers faster and with fewer headaches. Requirements, plans, and results are evaluated continuously so teams have a natural mechanism for responding to change quickly. So many teams, at least at smaller companies, don't have dedicated agile coaches, and even when they do, they often act in more of an advisory capacity rather than tackling certain aspects of software development hands-on. This means there are actually tons of opportunities for individual engineers to use agile to their advantage. Agile encourages, or really requires, planning, communication, and more to be successful. Let's talk through some of the phases of a project and tie them back to our 4 skill buckets that we talked about earlier. When we think about the delivery lifecycle, often our first phase is the discovery phase. This is where we talk about what we're building and why. It's really useful to any organization to have an engineer involved at this stage, and it's beneficial to them also. Being involved in the discovery phase hones important communication skills. Engineers might help in doing something like creating documentation describing the feature. Additionally, they'll spend plenty of time that they dedicated to this discovery sharing context. They'll need to gain context from product owners and designers, and then they'll share context that they have, which is often technical in nature, that might influence product decisions. That's also where we see a great planning skill, which is anticipating roadblocks. If building a particular feature requires something like a large-scale technical overhaul, that's a great thing to know in advance. It's even better to know if there are alternative approaches and what the side effects of those might be. While thinking this through, an engineer might also give some thought to the high-level estimation we previously discussed. Would this kind of effort be measured in days or weeks or months? Engineers who are involved in discovery will have to have empathy for folks who are often in different roles than just engineering. What's the product owner or the designer's motivation, and what are their most important considerations? Understanding their point of view will be critical in delivering useful feedback as part of discovery. Lastly, it's pretty obvious that a product focus is critical in this phase. Having empathy for the user will help engineers give feedback that's not purely technical and that considers the user's needs. And those roadblocks we talked about will come up in this phase as well, as the team considers various approaches and their potential impact on the user experience. In the next phase of planning, the team will often need a design document explaining what needs to happen at a high level in order to build a feature. Again, this is another place where an engineer might have the chance to practice some important skills. This sort of technical documentation is another awesome form of context sharing. This time the engineer needs to communicate differently. Instead of explaining technical details in a way that can guide product owners, they have to be able to explain the product context while putting the primary focus on technical implementation details and possible trade-offs. A technical design document could include, for example, an explanation of the expected phases of development. Other engineers will then have a spec to follow when they're doing more planning or actually implementing the feature. It's useful to have the author of the document seek input by presenting their documentation for feedback from others. Again, different perspectives are always valuable in uncovering important information, and that's where we're seeking input. Once the what of what we're building and how we would generally do it are understood at a high level, it's important to have a well-scoped set of tasks that the entire team can basically just pick up and run with. Writing stories is one of the parts of Agile software development that I think is very much underappreciated. A well-written set of tasks can be critical in determining the order in which work should be done, and that allows the team to ship value to the user faster. Stories and issues also provide a record of what was done and why, which is incredibly helpful when bugs or scope changes show up later, and we all know that happens all the time. The practice of writing stories is another activity that heavily depends on being good at context sharing. Stories are issues that explain what's being done and why, ones that include any necessary technical details or restrictions, and definitely ones that link back to design artifacts or other non-technical documentation make implementation that much easier. Breaking down work into the smallest logical pieces allows for faster implementation, as I mentioned earlier, but also enables a team to respond more easily to changing requirements, which is a core tenet of Agile itself. As part of writing stories, engineers get to practice estimation, which should be a way to help determine how fast the team as a whole can ship something. And a synchronous review in a planning meeting, for example, is also a great opportunity for an engineer to seek out a second, third, or fourth set of eyes to give input on the rationale, details, and estimates before active development begins. Of course, we know that Agile development is built on the principle that, to revisit our original quote, requirements, plans, and results are evaluated continuously so teams have a natural mechanism for responding to change quickly. And we all know that things can change super fast. It's important to have regular check-ins, whether they're asynchronous or in synchronous meetings, to be sure that the project is progressing as expected and that any changes can be reacted to easily and quickly. Again, context sharing is at the heart of these exercises. Especially when our engineer is in close contact with product, they have unique knowledge and information that allows them to explain to the rest of the team why requirements might be evolving and changing. Check-ins are also a great opportunity for engineers to give feedback on progress. Are things taking longer than expected? Why? Does someone need help? Are there blockers that they can clear? This is important information to bring out as development goes on. As always, the team should have the needs of the user at the forefront and consider any new information or research as development progresses. So, some teams find it useful and insightful to collect feedback from different audiences before a full feature is complete and shipped to every end user. This might look like reaching out to other parts of the company, like marketing or sales, to test something out, or releasing a private beta to a group of loyal users. This is another great opportunity to get involved and lead the team. Our engineer might be reviewing feedback from users in written form, watching recorded user interviews, or even conducting them themselves. All of these activities require empathy for the user, the ability to really put themselves in the user's shoes and understand their needs. That, of course, requires an openness and ability to accept feedback about work that they're really invested in and have spent a lot of time on, including learning that the user might have wildly different expectations than anticipated, and a pivot is necessary. And of course, we return to our central theme of context sharing. This information is only valuable if it can be brought back to the team and reacted to in a useful way, whether that's making small changes or a large change to the initiative itself. And one of my favorite and probably one of the most important aspects of Agile is the retrospective. This is the team's dedicated opportunity to reflect on a period of time or the entirety of a particular project and give useful feedback that will make the next project better, easier, faster. Iterative improvement is the key to a successful team. No one gets it right on the first try. A retrospective can provide a really useful and unique artifact that is not just the reflections that are written by the team, but the action items that are documented by the facilitator. And usually, in order to get good action items, the facilitator needs to prompt the group for actionable takeaways and then either follow up on them or ensure that someone else will. A whole bunch of reflections from a retrospective isn't useful if nobody does anything with them. Again, this is another time where empathy is key. Retros need to feel blameless with the understanding that everyone did the best they could with the information they had at the time, in order for teammates to feel comfortable sharing and responding to the feedback of others. So hopefully now you can see the many ways in which individual contributors can participate in Agile software development and align those practices with specific leadership skills that are really desirable and not always easy to develop if you're not doing so intentionally. You might be wondering a variety of things at this point, including what's the best way for my team to make sure that everyone, or everyone who wants to, gets to participate in these kinds of activities. I've seen some different processes at various companies I've worked for. Each one has pros and cons, but they can definitely give you a tangible framework for accomplishing your goals and one that you can tweak if you feel you need to. So we'll talk through a couple of those. One interesting process to follow is the concept of an Agile rotation, which is basically exactly what it sounds like. In this model, a group of engineers, or potentially the entire team, follows a rotation. Each engineer in the rotation takes on the role of Agile coach for the length of a single iteration. That could be a 1 or 2 week sprint, or a 6-week delivery cycle, essentially whatever unit the team already uses that works best for them. During this time, one engineer acts as the Agile coach. They engage in all the activities we've described thus far, including running ceremonies like planning meetings and retrospectives, doing discovery with product and design, and documenting and planning work through architectural documents or stories. There are a lot of upsides to this approach. Team members are really likely to develop empathy for the challenges that this work requires, meaning they're more understanding when others encounter challenges and more willing to help. This also distributes the work so it's not disproportionately resting on a single person's shoulders. The team also benefits from the unique skills and perspectives of different team members. While every engineer might be working toward honing the same leadership skills, each person will have a different approach or interpretation, a different perspective, and different strengths and weaknesses. The cons include things like the time it takes to ramp up for each iteration, and the discomfort that comes with somewhat frequent transitions. They become easier with time, but they definitely have a tangible cost. A second approach is the notion of having a couple of assigned roles on each team. Here, each group within your organization, which is probably a team ranging in size from like 4 to 6, what you might call a squad in the Spotify model, and each one of those squads or teams has 2 unique roles: an appointed Agile coach and a specific engineer who's expected to dedicate time and focus to working with product owners. In this model, our roles are longer lived. Again, there's no prescribed way to do this. They might last a quarter, a year, or an undefined period of time, and the roles might shift as folks decide if they do or don't like to do them and how it impacts the way they spend their time. The Agile coach within the group is responsible for running ceremonies like planning and retrospectives, checking in on blockers, and keeping stories up to date and estimated. The engineer who's assigned to work with the product team engages in activities like discovery and might produce design documents, conduct user interviews, and do the other types of product-focused work that we've identified. The 2 roles are highly collaborative, and they do have some overlapping responsibilities. Again, there are pros and cons to this approach too. Working to the team's advantage is the fact that there are less transitions, and the engineers have time to settle into their particular roles. This also allows for folks who don't want to be engaged in these types of activities to more easily opt out. There's just a few people doing it. And the disadvantages are that this model can't provide opportunities for everyone if there's a large percentage of the team that's interested in one or more of the roles. Additionally, it can sometimes have a long-term impact on the time an engineer has to dedicate to active development, like writing code. This is naturally expected from defined roles like a team or a tech lead, but it might be a bit of a gray area for an engineer who's acting in this unofficial capacity where it's not part of their true job description. So those are a couple of options, but at this point you might be ready to run back to your team and make some proposals, or you might be thinking, well, that all sounds great, but my team has like really strictly defined things that we do or roles that can't be negotiated. Or you might be thinking, like, I work for a huge organization where it's not that easy to influence sweeping changes across the entire org. And that's totally fine. I'd say think back to what we've reviewed, and if there's a skill you're looking to develop that ties into someone else's role, ask to shadow them or enter into a mentorship program if your organization offers that. Or you can find other ways to demonstrate your ability to, for example, share context and document your work that aren't part of the Agile process itself. Maybe that's leading an initiative like creating a better release process or outlining and advocating for better testing standards within your team, or encouraging your team to produce more technical documentation. Those are all actually specific activities that I've done during the course of my career that helped me be seen as a leader and ultimately led me to the next stop on my career path. You might also be wondering how you can influence change and help others progress in their careers when you're already in a leadership role. First, you can use the social capital that you have to suggest new ideas and practices, whether they're the ones we've discussed or others that have been brewing in your own mind. Additionally, there was one skill in our empathy bucket that I didn't address until now: mentorship. If you feel comfortable with a leadership activity, bring someone else in and show them the ropes. And to touch on another point from John Alspaugh's excellent article that I referred to earlier, one of the most important things you can do is sponsor others. Advocate for them. Allow them to take the lead on speccing out a project, with your advice or oversight if they need it, or ask them to run a meeting you might ordinarily be responsible for. This can go an incredibly long way. Elevate others when you can. And for those who have heard me speak before, there's one thing I always mention in my talks. I encourage you to take the ideas I've presented and make them your own. Take what works, get rid of the rest. Every individual and every team is different. I've seen that myself. But what I do know for sure is if you communicate well, actively engage in planning, display empathy, and focus on the product, you'll be seen as a leader, and what's more senior than that? Thank you, and feel free to reach out with thoughts or questions if you have them. Enjoy the rest of the conference.